In 1987, a mother and her two young daughters were brutally murdered in their apartment in Anchorage, Alaska. Microscopic clues from inside the apartment identified a family relative as a possible suspect. But how could investigators tell whether the evidence was fresh or had been there since long before the murders? Anchorage, Alaska is considered one of the most scenic cities.
That was very heinous and definitely out of the ordinary for Anchorage.
The coroner estimated the murders took place sometime on Saturday morning. None of the neighbors saw or heard anything unusual during that time. Although there were no signs of forced entry, Nancy Newman's camera and purse were missing from the apartment. A knife was also missing from a butcher block in the kitchen. A cookie tin that normally held Nancy's waitressing tips was empty on the kitchen table. A damp wash rag was found in the bathroom sink.
He was in a comfort zone inside that apartment. He knew this situation of these victims enough to know that he wouldn't, in all likelihood, be interrupted, that he could spend a significant amount of time. And we can tell he spent a significant amount of time. He had 3 different victims, 3 different bedrooms, 2 of them sexually assaulted. And then we had the person completely cleaning up. He had to be covered in blood.
John Newman was attending school in California. Police could find no evidence that he had returned to Alaska at the time of the murders and was not considered a suspect. But the killings reflected a great rage on the part of the perpetrator. Police wondered if Nancy Newman had made an enemy among co-workers or customers of the restaurant.
It was a difficult station that she worked. It was normally, single guys, and maybe they were hungover, maybe they were just being jerks, but she didn't let anybody upset her.
After the murders of Nancy Newman and her 2 daughters, Melissa and Angie, Anchorage residents feared that a random sex killer was on the loose.
Why didn't somebody hear Nancy's screams? I used to have dreams at night. I'd hear a woman screaming. And it would be, when you first fall asleep, and I'd wake up and I'd still hear the screams, but I didn't know what to do.
As a fingerprint examiner, once those fingerprints are fixed, we'll either photograph them as they develop or add different chemicals to that item to try to make the fingerprints visible so that we can preserve them and compare them to suspects or other individuals.
Kathy Monfrida found over 100 fingerprints in the apartment. Many did not belong to anyone in the immediate family. These prints were found on the inside of the front door, on the cookie tin, where Nancy Newman kept her waitressing tips, in the bathroom, and in other areas. Investigators identified the prints as those of Kirby Anthony, a nephew of the Newman family. Anthony was a 23-year-old drifter who had recently moved to Anchorage from Idaho. Since he needed a place to stay, the Newmans allowed him to move in temporarily.
Kirby had lived there with them. They had let him stay there. He was a relative. They felt sorry for him. They knew he'd had a troubled past. And so he had a legitimate reason for being in there, which means a lot to what we're going to discover and trace evidence.
They put him up, he stayed with them. He got it, and I think they got along okay, although we did hear later and learn that he didn't get along real well with Melissa, the 8-year-old.
Kirby Anthony admitted that living in a small apartment with 2 young children was difficult, and he told police he moved out amicably just 2 weeks before the murders. Furthermore, Kirby Anthony denied any knowledge of the attack and said he had an alibi. He told police he was out with friends on Friday night and spent Saturday morning eating breakfast at a Burger King restaurant. In addition to the fingerprints, investigators found large amounts of hair in almost every room of the Newmans' apartment. The hairs were Caucasian and were not similar to anyone in the Newman family. Anchorage police sent the hairs to the FBI, the damp wash rag found in the Newman sink after the murders. On the wash rag were some green wool fibers which matched a pair of gloves found in Nancy Newman's bedroom. Also on the wash rag were traces of the victim's blood. Finally, Dietrich made a startling discovery. On the wash rag were pubic hairs with partial egg casings from pubic lice, an extremely rare finding. The hairs were microscopically similar to Kirby Anthony, and investigators discovered that Anthony had recently been treated for pubic lice. And there was more evidence linking Kirby Anthony to the Newman crime scene. One was the location of Kirby Anthony's palm print in a particularly unusual location.
Above Melissa's bed, on the wall, an entire left handprint was developed. The significance of the latent prints was that they helped assist the investigators in solidifying their ideas of what happened that day.
Melissa had been sexually assaulted. The print, only 10 inches above her head, was telling. Anthony's fingerprints were also found on the container that Nancy Newman used to hold the cash tips from the restaurant. Kirby Anthony's roommate told police that on the morning of the murders, Anthony had walked into their apartment with blood on his clothing and immediately washed everything he was wearing. The roommate also revealed that Anthony was counting a large amount of change later that same day. Police were still missing two important pieces of evidence: the murder weapon and a motive. As the investigation into the murders of Nancy Newman and her two daughters continued, more and more evidence pointed to the Newmans' nephew, Kirby. Investigators had one last piece of physical evidence to examine: the vacuum cleaner Nancy Newman used to clean her apartment. A neighbor told police Nancy Newman vacuumed her apartment shortly before the murders.
I wouldn't call her exactly a clean freak, not obsessively clean freak, but for somebody with two little kids, and I had two little kids, it was a very neat, well-ordered place.
When Doug Dietrich looked inside the vacuum cleaner bag, he saw many separate layers of dirt. Each layer was different. The top layer was the most recent layer of dirt. In it, Dietrich could find only one pubic hair from Kirby Anthony. The absence of Kirby Anthony's pubic hairs in the top layer of dirt in the vacuum bag, along with the presence of a great deal of his pubic hair at the murder scene, indicated that Kirby Anthony had been inside the apartment between the time it was last vacuumed and the time of the murders.
The theory being is if we've got a lot of pubic hairs that are microscopically similar to Kirby Anthony's at the scene during the course of our trace lift at the murder scenes, but we don't have any of his pubic hairs, or have very few of his pubic hairs in the vacuumings, then that would show that those hairs were deposited after the residence was vacuumed and during the commission of the murders.
Sensing an arrest was imminent, Kirby Anthony ran for the Canadian border, where he was arrested.
If I saw Kirby today, I'd shoot him. Run over him with a car. Just whatever. And you know, that would ruin my life. This man has scarred so many people. What he did to Nancy and the girls was unthinkable.
Prosecutors believe that the microscopic trail of evidence Kirby Anthony left behind clearly shows his path on the morning of the murders. The theory was that Anthony was angry after he was forced to vacate the Newmans' apartment and sought revenge. The night before the murders, friends said Kirby was using cocaine and alcohol.
Mommy said we know stinks. That's enough of those. Quiet.
The next morning, Anthony entered the Newmans' apartment. The children were sent to their rooms.
John and I asked you to leave. You shouldn't even be here. You're not welcome.
At some point, Anthony grabbed a kitchen knife and forced Nancy Newman into her bedroom. Wearing wool gloves he found in the bedroom, he raped and strangled Nancy Newman with a pillowcase. Then he entered Melissa's bedroom, assaulting and killing her too, leaving his palm print above her bed. The evidence suggests Anthony cleaned himself in the bathroom, leaving the damp washcloth complete with his pubic hair lice, the green wool fibers, and the victim's blood in the sink. He then killed 3-year-old Andrew.
By cocaine, I think he went over there in a rage.
It mystifies me how a person could have so much rage inside him that he can commit such a crime. I've reported on dozens and dozens of murders over the years. This one, you just can't quite justify how someone could have that much rage and anger built up in them that they would do that. There's no explaining it.
Nancy Newman's camera, the one found in Kirby Anthony's possession after the murders, contained family photos taken during happier times. Pictures of the lives destroyed by a senseless act of revenge.